Dear students, in this final week of our class on management of organizations, we will further our discussions on the leading managerial functions. And we'll be looking at chapter 16, which is on leadership and influence processes. The learning objectives for this chapter will include an understanding of the nature of leadership and how it relates to management. We'll also have discussions or thoughts on the two generic approaches to leadership, also look at the major situational approaches to leadership and three related approaches to leadership. We'll also further our views by looking at the emerging approaches to leadership as well as political behavior in organizations and how such behaviors could be managed. The meaning of leadership. Leadership is both a process and a property. And as a process, leadership is about the use of non coercive influence to shape the group's or organization's goals, motivate behavior toward the achievement of those goals, and help define group or organizational culture. So we find out that as a process, leadership is all about setting and driving the delivery of vision, objectives, and strategic plans of organizations. Whereas as a property, leadership will be the set of characteristics that are attributed to individuals who are perceived to be leaders. So we'll find out that leadership as a property basically refers to the attributes and the features of leaders, right? So we'll understand that leadership basically occurs through the use of influence and not the use of force. So leaders basically are those who are accepted by other people. They don't just declare themselves leaders, right? So leaders must have followers. So looking at this slide, we'll see that leaders are people who can influence the behaviors of others without having to rely on force, and they also have to be accepted by others as their leaders. The table on this slide is basically relaying the distinctions between management and leadership. We'll find out that leadership and management are related in very many ways, but they are different, right? For example, the management side of executing plans within organizations focuses on the monitoring of results, comparing those results with the goals that have been set up in issue, and correcting deviations, right? Taking corrective actions, right? But in contrast, the leadership side of executing plans within organizations basically focuses on energizing people to overcome bureaucratic hurdles to enable them actually reach their goals, right? So you find out that organizations need both effective management and strong leaders if they want to be successful. Leadership and power. Power is the ability to affect the behavior of others. And we'll find out that in organizations, there are usually five kinds of power, and they include the legitimate power, the reward power, the coercive power, the referent power, and the expert power. Now, legitimate power is power granted through the organizational hierarchy, the power defined by the organization to be accorded to people occupying a particular position. So it's basically the same thing as authority. Legitimate power would be considered authority within organizations since it's accorded to positions, right? Now, reward power is the power managers have to give or withhold rewards such as salary increases, bonuses, promotions, praise, recognition, and interesting job assignments. Furthering our discussion on leadership and power, coercive power. Coercive power is the power to force compliance by means of psychological, emotional, or physical threats, right? So you find out that coercion, which emanates from the coercive power, right? It will include verbal and written reprimands or queries, right? It will include disciplinary layoffs or sack, right? Or maybe termination of employment, right? It will include fines, it will include demotion, it will even include termination of appointment, right? Or termination of employment as the case may be. Now looking at referent power. This is the personal power that accrues to someone based on identification, imitation, loyalty, or charisma, right? So you find out that most often than not, the followers of such a leader may react favorably because they identify in some way with that leader, who may be like them in personality, may be like them in background, or the leader may be like them in attitudes, right? Now you have the expert power, which is the personal power that accrues to someone based on the information or expertise that he or she possesses. So invariably, expert power is the power of competence. Leadership traits. Generic or universal approaches to leadership assume that there was one set of answers to the leadership puzzle, right? And they came up with traits, leadership traits. And the trait approach assumed that some basic traits or maybe some set of traits existed that differentiated leaders from non leaders. And if those traits could be defined, scholars basically propose that when such traits could be defined, then potential leaders could be identified based on the extent to which they did or did not possess those traits, right? And those scholars thought that leadership traits or those traits might include intelligence, assertiveness, above average height, good vocabulary, attractiveness, and self confidence. Just to piggyback on the above average height, right? There was one class I took on the American electoral tradition, and in one of those classes, if I recall correctly, there was a United States president that was voted in basically because of his looks, right? Because according to my professor in that class, the ladies believed that he had good looks. So it alludes to the thought of this trait approach, which says that a leader would possess, for starters, attractiveness as a trait and above average height, because this president was definitely above average height and was seen to be good looking, right? And that was why most votes came in favor of him, because they believed that leaders should be attractive and good looking. Now, also, during the first half of the 20th century, hundreds of studies were conducted to actually identify important leadership traits, but the result of these studies did not establish empirical relationships between traits and the persons that were regarded as leaders. So, for every set of leaders who possessed a common trait, a long list of exceptions were also found, right? And the list of suggested traits grew so long that it had little or no practical value eventually. That was why the trait approach was basically downplayed, right? And then the behavioral approach was adopted. And the behavioral approach was basically motivated by their lack of success or this lack of scholarly success in identifying useful leadership traits. So you find out that scholars began to investigate what behaviors or actions are basically expressed by leaders, right? And the new hypothesis was that effective leaders somehow behave differently than less effective leaders, right? Michigan Studies by Rensis Likert. So you find out that researchers or scholars at the University of Michigan, led by Rensis Likert, they identified two common forms of leader behavior, right? One would be managers that use job-centered leader behavior, and the managers that adopt employee-centered leader behavior, right? So for the job-centered leader behavior, you find out that this leader behavior involves paying close attention to the work of subordinates, explaining the work procedures, and maintaining strong or keen interest in how well those subordinates perform. Whereas the employee-centered behavior is such that it involves developing a cohesive work group and ensuring that employees are satisfied with their jobs, right? So the two forms of leader behaviors were considered to be at opposite ends of the same continuum, right? And Likert argued that employee-centered leader behavior generally tends to be more effective. Ohio State Studies. Now, the research conducted at the Ohio State University suggested that there are two basic leader behaviors or leadership styles, right? And they include the initiating structure behavior and the consideration behavior. Now, the initiating structure behavior would be the behavior of leaders who define the leader subordinate role so that everyone knows what is expected, or their subordinates know what are expected of them. Such leaders establish formal lines of communication and determine how tasks will be performed, whereas the leaders that actually possess the consideration behavior show concern for their subordinates and they attempt to establish a warm, friendly, and supportive climate, right? So the initial assumption was that most effective leaders exhibit high levels of both behaviors. And one difference that exists between the Michigan studies and the Ohio State studies is that the Ohio State researchers did not interpret leader behavior as being one dimensional, right? Each behavior was assumed to be independent of the other. Further on the Ohio State studies, right, the research indicated that employees of supervisors that ranked high on the initiating structure were high performers. Yet, such employees expressed low levels of satisfaction and higher absenteeism, whereas the employees of supervisors that ranked high on consideration behavior had low performance ratings. But in having low performance rating, they equally had high levels of satisfaction and less absenteeism, right? So you find out that other situational variables make consistent leader behavior predictions difficult, right? In the sense that there is no universal or one best way model of leadership. Leadership grid. The leadership grid provides a means for evaluating leadership styles and then training managers to move toward an ideal style of behavior. So it is based on two forms of leader behavior, and they include one, the concern for production, and the concern for people. Now, the concern for production will be the part of the leadership grid that deals with the job and task aspects of leader behavior, whereas the concern of the people will be the part of, or rather, the concern for people will be the part of the leadership grid that deals with the human aspects of leader behavior, right? And you'll find out, according to the leadership grid, there are five extremes of managerial behavior, right? There's the 1-1 manager, which is considered impoverished management, and such managers exhibit minimal concern for both production and people. There's the 9-1 manager, which is considered authority compliance, and such managers are highly concerned about production but exhibit little concern for people. And you have the 1-9 manager, which is considered the country club management, whereby managers are highly concerned about their subordinates but they exhibit little concern for production. Also, there's the 5-5 manager, which is seen as the middle of the road management, right? Where managers maintain adequate concern for both people and production. And you have the 9-9 manager, which is seen as the team management, where managers exhibit maximum concern for both people and production, right? And according to this approach, or the leadership grid approach, right, the ideal style of managerial behavior would be the 9-9 manager, right? It encourages leaders to focus on their behaviors and not traits. The diagram on this slide is an illustration of the leadership grid, right? And from what we discussed in the previous slide, you can just see all the 1-1, the 9-1, the 1-9, the 5-5, and the 9-9 managerial behavior, right? So the leader behavior theories have played an important role in developing contemporary thinking about leadership, right? So you find out that it urges us as scholars too, or as students, to not be occupied with who the leaders are, like the trait approach, but to concentrate on what leaders do, their behaviors, right? But these theories also make universally generic prescriptions about what constitutes effective leadership. And you find out that when we deal with complex social systems that actually comprises complex individuals, few, if any, relationships of leadership behavior is actually consistently predictable, right? And there are no formulas for success, right? So behavioral or the behavior theories often failed when trying to find a dependable prescription for effective leadership, because variables could change, complexities of the environment could actually impact which leadership behavior would be ideal for that situation, right? Because of this, other approaches to understanding leadership were actually needed. Situational approaches to leadership. So, from our discussions from the previous slide about leader behavior, right, and how that could change given the complexities of the environment or the situation, right, thus the need for these situational approaches to leadership. And the goal of situational approaches to leadership is to identify key situational factors and to specify how they interact to determine appropriate leader behavior, right? The assumptions of these situational approaches would include that appropriate leader behavior varies from one situation to another, and that situational factors that determine appropriate leader behavior can be identified, right? So, four of the most important and widely accepted situational theories of leadership are: one, the least preferred co-worker theory, or the LPC theory, right? Then you have the path goal theory. Then you have the Vroom's decision tree approach, and you have the leader member exchange approach, or LMX approach. The least preferred co-worker theory. This is a theory of leadership that suggests that the appropriate style of leadership varies with situational favorableness, right? So, this theory argues that the style of behavior is a reflection of the leader's personality, and that most personalities fall into one of two categories, right? One will be the task oriented personality, which is analogous to the job centered and initiating structured behaviors. Then you have the relationship oriented personality, which is similar to the employee centered and consideration behaviors of both the Michigan and the Ohio State studies, right? Now you find out that the scholar who developed this theory, who is called Fred Ferdler, he measured leadership style by means of a controversial questionnaire called the least preferred co-worker measure. And this measure, or this questionnaire, basically has a scale which asks leaders to describe the person with whom he or she, or with whom they are able to work least well with, right? The least preferred co-worker. And the total score for the scale presumably reflects the leader's personality type, right? So a high total score is assumed to reflect a relationship orientation, rather, on the part of the leader, whereas a low total score reflects a task orientation personality on the part of the leader. Further on the least preferred co-worker theory, we'll be looking at situational favorableness variables, right? Favorableness of the situation is determined by leader-member relations, the task structure, and the position power, right? So leader-member relations relates to the nature of the relationship between the leader and the work group, right? Where there is a high degree of mutual trust, respect, and confidence, it's indicative of a good relationship, right? Now, task structure refers to the degree to which the group's task is defined, and position power would be the power vested in the leader's position and the leader's ability to assign work and administer rewards and punishment. Now, favorableness and leader style. When the situation is the most favorable, whereby there is good leader-member relations, there is high task structure, and there is strong position power, or the least favorable, whereby there is bad leader-member relations, low task structure, and weak position power, the best leadership style will be the task-oriented leadership style. Whereas relationship-oriented leaders are most effective when the situation is only moderately favorable. Now, flexibility of leader style. This scholar, Fred Fiedler, argued that because the leader style is fixed, the situation should be changed to fit the leader style in order to make him or her most effective. The diagram on this slide is an illustration of the least preferred co-worker theory. Path goal theory. The path goal theory of leadership is such that it clarifies for the subordinates the kind of behavior that will lead to goal accomplishment and valued rewards, right? So this is a theory of leadership suggesting that the primary functions of a leader are to make valued or desired rewards available in the workplace, and also to clarify to the subordinates or clarify for their subordinates the kind of behaviors that will lead to those rewards, right? And this theory identifies 4 kinds of leader behavior, and they will include the directive behavior, supportive behavior, participative behavior, and achievement-oriented leader behavior. Still on the path goal theory, we'll be discussing the leader behaviors that are identified by the path goal theory. Now, the directive leader behavior is about letting subordinates know, or the leader letting their subordinates know what is expected of them, giving them guidance and direction, as well as scheduling their work, right? The supportive leader behavior is when the leader is being friendly and approachable, having concern for their subordinates' welfare, and treating subordinates as equals, right? Now, the participative leader behavior will be such that the leader consults with the subordinates, soliciting suggestions from them and allowing participation in decision making, right? And the achievement-oriented leader behavior will be a situation where the leader sets challenging goals, expecting subordinates to perform at high levels as well, and the leader also encourages and shows confidence in their subordinates, right? So you find out that the achievement oriented leader behavior is about the leader showing confidence in their subordinates' abilities. And in contrast to Fiedler's theory, right, of the least preferred co-worker theory, right, the path goal theory assumes that leaders can change their style or behavior to meet the demands of a particular situation. Now, the situational factors that must be assessed include the personal characteristics of the subordinates and the environmental characteristics of the workplace, right? Now, the important Personal characteristics of subordinates include if the subordinates' perception of their own abilities and their locus of control. So how confident are they about how well their efforts could actually impact the outcome of their tasks? Now, environmental excuse me, characteristics that have to be assessed may include factors outside the subordinate's control, such as the task structure, the formal authority system, and the nature of the work group, how cohesive the work group is. The diagram on this slide is basically an illustration of the path goal framework or the path goal theory, right? Basically highlighting the subordinate personal characteristics that would affect how effective the leader behavior is towards achieving performance, right? Looking at the leader behavior and looking at the environmental characteristics and how they all impact the subordinate's motivation towards performance. The Vroom's decision tree approach to leadership. Now, the Vroom's decision tree approach predicts what kinds of situations call for different degrees of group participation, right? What kinds of situation the leader has to actually incorporate or actually solicit for suggestion or input from their subordinates towards decision making, right? And the basic premises of the Vroom's decision tree approach is that this approach assumes that the degree to which subordinates should be encouraged to participate in decision making depends on the characteristics of the situation. So, what we mean is that no one decision making process is best for all situations, right? So, it depends on the situation. Now, the current formulation suggests that managers use one of two different decision trees, right? One decision tree is to be used when the decision needs to be made as quickly as possible, whereas the other decision tree is to be used when time is less critical and the manager wants to help subordinates improve and develop their own decision making skills. So you find out that there are two situations. One, a situation where decision making requires urgency, and another whereby it's less urgent, so the manager could actually incorporate input from the subordinates as a way of actually trying to develop the subordinate skills, the subordinate decision making skills. So having them participate in decision making would actually up their skills with regards to decision making. Further on the Vroom's decision tree approach, we find out that after evaluating a problem's attributes, then a leader can choose a decision path out of those two decision trees that determines the decision style and specifies the amount or the degree of employee participation. So the considerations will be: one, what's the significance of the decision that is to be made, right? The impact of the decision on the organization. Subordinates are involved when decision significance is high. Now, the timeliness of the decision to be made. So, the time pressure for deciding may preclude involving subordinates. So, when there's urgency for decision to be made, then subordinates may be left out because of the urgency for that decision to be made. Finally, on the Vroom's decision tree, now we find out that decision making styles, right? To maximize effectiveness of decisions, one of five leadership styles should be adopted for decision making, right? Depending on the situation. And the first of such leadership styles would be to decide. And this style actually precludes that the manager makes the decision alone and then announces or sells it to their group, right, or to their work group. And the second decision making style will be to consult, right, consulting each individual member of the team or individual member of the work group or each individual subordinate, right? So the manager presents the program to the group members individually, obtains their suggestions, and then makes the decision. Now, also another decision making style would be to consult the employees or subordinates as a group rather than individually. Here, the manager presents the problem to the group members at a meeting, gets their suggestions, and then makes the decision. Another style will be to facilitate the decision making, whereby the manager presents the problem to the group at a meeting, defines the problem and its boundaries, and then facilitates the group member discussion rather as they make the decision. And finally, one of the other styles proposed by the Vroom's decision tree approach would be to delegate, right, as a decision making style, whereby the manager allows the group to define for itself the exact nature and parameters of the problem and then to develop the solution, right? So autonomy for decision making is granted to the subordinates or to the work group of the manager. So you find out that the Vroom's decision tree approach represents a focused but complex perspective on leadership, right? So, and to actually cushion this difficulty, expert system software is available to help managers assess a situation accurately and quickly, and then to make an appropriate decision regarding employee participation, right? Now, the evaluation and implications, basically, Vroom's current approach is new and not fully scientifically tested or empirically tested, right? So, but the original model and its subsequent refinements were generally supported by research. So the table on this slide basically illustrates how what behavior, what style, decision making style the leader or the manager will adopt when time is of the essence, right? When there's urgency for the decision to be made. And the table on this slide is basically an illustration for the decision making style of the leader or the manager when the whole idea is to develop the decision making capabilities or decision making skills of their subordinates where time is not of the essence. There is no urgency for the decision to be made. The leader member exchange approach. So the LMX model basically stresses the fact that leaders have different kinds of relationships with different subordinates. Those that are close to the manager are considered the in-group members, and they receive better treatment than those subordinates that are considered the out-group members. So this in-group and out-group leader member exchange or leader member relationship is considered a vertical dyadic relationship because you have the manager or leader at the top and there's kind of a reporting relationship, a reporting line, right, from the subordinates to the leader. It's a vertical reporting line. It's not lateral, it's not horizontal. That's why such relationship is considered a vertical dyadic relationship, a vertical networked relationship, right? Because it's from the subordinate to the leader, it's on a hierarchy rather than on a lateral level, right? It's not on a horizontal level. And this vertical dyadic relationship basically states that the supervisor or the manager or the leader initiates either an in-group or out-group relationship with the subordinates or their employees, right? And the in-group members have been found to have higher performance and satisfaction levels than the out-group members. So the diagram on this slide is an illustration of the leader member exchange model, right? So you can see the leader at the top and you can see the subordinates that belong to the in group have unbroken lines, meaning it shows the strength of the relationship. There is a strong relationship between the leader and the in group subordinates, whereas there are broken dyadic lines, right? There are broken network vertical lines between the leader and the outgroup subordinates, showing that the strength of the relationship isn't that strong. It's a weak relationship between the leader and the outgroup subordinates. Substitutes for leadership. Now, for leadership would refer to a concept that identifies situations in which leader behaviors are neutralized or replaced by characteristics of the subordinate, the task, and the organization. Now, looking at the characteristics of the subordinate, right? This may serve to neutralize leader behavior, and they include the ability of the subordinate, experience, their need for independence, their professional orientation, indifference toward organizational goals, right? Their indifference towards organizational goals or rewards, right? Now, looking at the task characteristics that may substitute for leadership, they will include the routineness of the task, right? The availability of feedback, or the availability of, or the presence of intrinsic satisfaction of such subordinate or employee, right? Now, organizational characteristics that may substitute for leadership include formalization, right? Group cohesion, inflexibility, or rigid reward structure that may exist within the organization. Charismatic leadership. Charismatic leadership assumes that charisma is an individual characteristic of the leader, right? And charisma is a form of interpersonal attraction that inspires support and acceptance. Further on charismatic leadership, we find out that there are three elements of charismatic leadership in organizations which most experts or scholars acknowledge, right? And that would be one, that charismatic leaders must envision the future, set high expectations, and model behaviors that are consistent with meeting those expectations. Also, charismatic leaders must be able to energize others through a demonstration of personal excitement, personal confidence, and patterns of success. Now, lastly, charismatic leaders enable others by supporting them, empathizing with them, and expressing confidence in them. Transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is the leadership that goes beyond ordinary expectations by transmitting a sense of mission, stimulating learning experiences, and inspiring new ways of thinking, right? So, transformational leadership is considered vital to the success of businesses. And on the slide, list are some transformational leaders or people that are considered transformational leaders. Emerging approaches to leadership. Strategic leadership. This is the capability of a leader to understand the complexities of both the organization and its environment, and to lead change in the organization to achieve and maintain superior alignment between the organization and its environment. So you find out that for someone to be an effective strategic leader, or for a manager to be an effective strategic leader, the manager must have a thorough and complete understanding of the organization, right? The manager will understand the organization's history, the organization's culture. Now, the SWOT analysis, the manager has to understand what the strengths and weaknesses of the organization are, as well as what are the opportunities and threats in the organization's environment, right? So, you find out that the strategic leader, in identifying what the opportunities and threats, they need to have a firm grasp of the organization's environment, right? Both the internal environment, looking at the strengths and weaknesses, and the external environment, looking at the opportunities and threats. And they need to recognize how the firm is currently aligned with its environment, and they work to improve both the current and future alignment. That is what, or those are the things strategic leaders do when they are effective, right? Now you have the cross-cultural leadership, which is the capability of a leader to provide purpose and direction that encompasses both international and diversity-based cultural differences in the organization, right? So the short form for it, what I call it, would be culture polycentrism, right? So this is another new approach to leadership based on cross-cultural issues. And in this context, culture is used as a broad concept to encompass the international differences that are existent within organizations, as well as the diversity that may be experienced within one culture that exists within the organization. Further on emerging issues to leadership, you have ethical leadership, which involves providing a strong corporate governance model to the organization that reflects the high ethical standards of its leaders, right? Ethical leadership requires holding those who lead the organization accountable for their actions and the consequences of their actions. So, ethical leadership, succinctly, may be regarded as code of corporate governance, right? And you find out that this came to being in the wake of major corporate scandals. Top managers are now being called on to maintain high ethical standards for their own conduct, to exhibit ethical behavior unfailingly, and to hold others in the organization to the same standards, right? So they have to model the behavior as well as hold others accountable, as well as hold themselves to the same standard, right? So those people that are responsible for hiring new leaders are basically looking more and more closely at the background of those that are being considered for leadership positions, right? And the emerging pressures for stronger corporate governance models are likely to further increase commitment to selecting only those individuals with high ethical standards, right? So, in the search for people to occupy leadership positions, you find out that this code of corporate governance and a strong corporate governance model that exists within an organization would ensure that only people with high ethical standards are employed, right, or are brought on board to do the job. So people that are actually searching for leaders to, or people who occupy leadership positions, are committed by virtue of this corporate governance model to actually select only people that are considered highly ethical. Common political behaviors. Political behavior, these are the activities carried out for the specific purpose of acquiring, developing, and using power and other resources to obtain one's preferred outcomes, right? Now, political behavior may be directed upward, the organization may be directed downward, the organization, or even laterally within the organization, right? And common political behaviors that were identified through research would include, research showed that these political behaviors are widely practiced within organizations, and they include: one, inducement, where managers offer to give something to someone in return for support, right? So giving something in return for support, basically. Now, persuasion will be some reliance of a manager on manipulation of logic and emotions, right? Or reliance of an employee of an organization relying on manipulation of logic and emotions. Now you have the political behavior, right? When a manager does a favor in hopes of receiving one in return, right? That is basically creating an obligation. Then you have coercion, where the manager uses force to get one's way, right? May threaten to withhold support or reward, since they have the power, the reward power, right? They could withhold support for allocation of resources, or they could withhold the rewards or even other resources, right? Now you have a concept called the impression management, which is a direct and intentional effort by someone to enhance their images in the eyes of others, right? So you find out that people may engage in impression management to further their own careers, to boost their self-esteem, and to acquire more power and control. Also, people may attempt to manage how others perceive them through their appearance, or by jockeying for association only with successful projects. That way, they are trying to manage the impression others have of them. Managing political behaviors. So there are guidelines for effective management of political behavior, right? The first will be to be aware that others may assume your actions are politically motivated even when they are not, right? Also, managers should provide subordinates with autonomy, responsibility, challenges, and feedback to reduce the likelihood of political behavior. Also, managers should avoid using power to avoid charges of political motivation. They should also get disagreements out in the open so that subordinates would have less opportunity for political behavior through using conflict for their own purposes, right? Managers should avoid covert activities to steer clear of even the impression of political intent. They should clearly communicate the basis and processes for performance evaluation. They should tie rewards directly to performance and also try to minimize competition for available resources. Those are some avenues or approaches towards stemming down political behaviors within organizations.